I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything, but I hope what I want to do is give you enough information so that you can make an educated guess on your own. The other thing is with this virus, the information is changing on a daily basis. So some of the information I will give you today probably will be obsolete in a week or 2 weeks, but I think the basic foundation will be there to help you to make that decision. So the Bible tells us in 1 Thessalonians, the 5th chapter and 21st verse, that we should test all things. And basically that tells us as Christians that we should not necessarily believe what people have to say, but we should look at the evidence. We should look at the evidence. And so that's what we're going to do today. So today I'm going to go over 4 aspects of this, and I would ask that you hold any questions till the end because I have a lot of information to give you. First, we're going to give you a quick update on the disease, COVID itself. We're going to talk about the vaccine development, vaccine side effects, and then vaccine distribution and why to consider taking the vaccine. So real quickly about disease update. Now, for those of you who are members of the Genesee Church of Christ, you've seen this slide before, but those of you who are not, the coronavirus is a messenger RNA virus, and it's not new, okay? So a lot of people talk about the novel coronavirus, but it's only novel in the sense that it's just novel because it's transmitted from bats to humans in China. But when you look at the slide, you can see back to BC that there were several different coronaviruses back before the birth of Christ. And then in 2003, we had COVID-1, which was transmitted from bats to humans, and it was seen mainly in Singapore and China. And then we had basically another COVID virus that came up in Saudi Arabia, which was transmitted by bats to humans, to camels to humans. And then recently, as of 2019, 2020, we've had the Wuhan virus, which has been committed from bats to humans. So as the Bible said, there's nothing new under the sun. Now, these are the classic symptoms of COVID, which I won't go over, but just to remind you, everybody talks about the high fever, the tiredness, the muscle and joint aches, and the dry cough. We know it mainly affects the lungs, and as a result of it's affecting the lungs, it can lead to death. But I wanted to show you a chest x-ray so you can understand how devastating this is to your lungs. So up here in the left-hand corner is a normal chest x-ray. You can see pretty much the translucency of the lungs. This is a chest x-ray of someone who has a bacterial pneumonia. You can see some of what we call infiltrates here and here and here. And then this is a viral pneumonia, which is what COVID is. So if you get a viral pneumonia like influenza, then your lungs become a little bit less clear than they were in the normal. But this is a chest x-ray of someone with COVID. And you can see that the lungs are pretty much what we call in medicine, totally whited out. So that's how this disease takes over your body. It just pretty much takes over your lungs, whites out your lungs, inhibits your ability to absorb oxygen. So it basically just suffocates you to death. Now, these are some of the data that I presented back in April, and I put this up here just for emphasis so we can realize where we were and where we are now. So this is United States data as of April of 2020. As you can see, we had about 800,000 cases, 44,000 deaths. This is where we are as of January the 9th, 21 million cases and over 350,000 deaths. So in the span of less than a year, this illness has been pretty devastating. In the state of Ohio, I thought this was striking. If you look at our numbers in Ohio, we had 13,000 reported cases back in April, 557 deaths. And this is where we are as of January the 9th, over 88,000 deaths and 670,000 cases. And this is January the 9th data. We probably added another 3,000 cases to this as of today. But you've heard in the past that people talk about the fact that, oh, don't worry about the virus, 99% of people recover. I looked up the data, actually the recovery rate in the United States is like 98.3%, but percentages can be a little bit deceiving. And so that basically means that 1.7% of people who get this disease die. So let's look at it a different way. So if the recovery rate is 98.3% and the mortality rate is 1.7%, and you've heard people talk about, we just need to let the virus run its course, if we let the virus run its course, there's 331 million people in the United States of America, basically meaning if left unchecked, over 5 million people would die of this virus in the United States. So we're at 355,000 and we're currently rising on a daily basis. So the concept of just letting nature take its course is just not feasible, but you'll hear people talk about percentages. You need to put that percentage in perspective. So let's talk about Black and brown people, particularly African Americans. There's 42 million of us in the United States. So therefore, if we left this virus go unchecked in the Black community with a mortality rate of 1.7%, that means over 714,000 of us would die. And that's a pretty significant number. Now, that's not all the story, okay? So that number probably would be even higher if we let it run its course, because we know for various reasons, systemic racism, health inequities, food insecurity, housing insecurity, educational insecurity, just flat out cultural incompetency. But this is a slide from September, and you can clearly see that in our community, it affects Blacks twice the amount that it affects whites. And that's also true in indigenous people, the Latinx community, but particularly in our community, the mortality rate is twice that of white Americans. So when you look at that 714,000, that's based upon equality. In our community, it's not. So that number would be even higher if we leave this disease unchecked. Now, I just pulled this straight off the press, January the 7th, 2021. One of the things we have to understand is that this disease, the main cause of transmission of this disease is from asymptomatic individuals. So this is straight out of the Journal of American Medical Association, January the 7th, 2021. The CDC has suggested that asymptomatic people walking around streets, transmit the majority of this disease, okay? And that's significant because when you have this argument about people wearing masks, everybody should wear a mask because we don't know who's infected and who is not. The other thing that we don't know is who will die from this disease and who will not, okay? So just keep that in mind, and that's hot off the presses. So you can still catch the disease from an infected person who may not even know they have it. We call these asymptomatic spreaders, okay? So I've talked about the need to wear a mask, but death is only part of this, okay? So when you hear people talk about the disease, they talk mainly about people dying and the mortality rate, but there's more, okay? So next, let's talk about organs that are affected with COVID-19, long-term symptoms associated with the disease, and long-term organ damage. So when you look at COVID-19, we tend to think that it only affects the lungs, but it also affects the heart and blood vessels, especially in young athletic males. A condition known as myocarditis, I'll talk a little bit about that later. But when you think about our community in general, football players, college basketball players, so forth and so on, that myocarditis is really significant. I read an article early into this disease, a Division III offensive lineman, can't remember the university, got COVID and died of myocarditis. No one talked about it. There was no discussion about it. And then it affects your brain, okay? And so we have people who get the disease and it affects your ability to make decisions, it causes depression, and it causes you just to have what they call brain fog. It can affect your eyes, your ears, your nose, your liver. It can cause renal failure. It can also cause intestinal problems, such as abdominal pain. And so these are things that we spend a lot of time talking about the lungs, but it also can affect multiple organs. The other thing that it does is in patients who have COVID-19, you can get blood clots, which can cause heart attacks, strokes, pulmonary embolus. So one of the brothers who used to be at East Chestnut, at East Genesee Avenue, Brother Matt Wooten, is now finishing up his critical care fellowship at East Carolina University. And I talked to Matt about 2-3 months ago, and we were talking about COVID. And so he's in the intensive care unit there. And he said, Brother Sanders, I have to tell you, I'm amazed. Most of his cases are young African-American males, young Hispanic males. And he says the number of these patients who came in with what they call thrombotic events from what they call hypercoagulability, meaning blood clots, he said was tremendous. He said, it's just really depressing to see a young man come in at his age and die of blood clots from COVID. And so that was early on in the disease, and there was not a lot of discussion about this. Okay, but I want you to know it's there. So when someone recently has a heart attack or stroke, one of the things the doctor should do is check them for COVID-19, because they may not come in with the pulmonary symptoms, but they may come in with this. The other thing that's you've heard is that, well, it really does affect the little kids. And early on in the disease, I think that was true only because of the fact that we didn't have the infection has not spread that much. We didn't have that many people infected. We didn't see that much transmission, okay? But as it's transmitted across all the different age groups, we're starting to see more and more kids infected. And this is a little kid who has what they call the inflammatory, multi-system inflammatory syndrome, which is consistent with a preceding illness, consistent with COVID, or someone who has had a COVID sick contact, meaning the kid has been exposed to an asymptomatic spreader or to someone who's had the disease, and then they get it. And I'm not going to go over all these symptoms, but they get mucocutaneous manifestations. And this is an example of a little kid who has these morbilliform rashes. It can affect fevers, muscle pain, tachycardia, low blood pressure. It can cause different neurologic symptoms in the kid, chest pain, respiratory distress, and GI problems, okay? So it can affect little kids. It doesn't affect them to the same degree as older, because God has blessed the little kids with an immune system which is still learning and growing and stuff. But don't kid yourself. It can affect kids, okay? And that's something to keep in mind. And so some of the long-term symptoms in those who have, quote, recovered, you hear people say, well, I got it and I recovered. Well, did you really recover? Because some people still have chronic fatigue because of lung damage. They'll have shortness of breath. They'll have muscle and joint pain, chest pain, permanent loss of taste and smell. And then there's brain fog. And I'm not trying to be funny here, but I'm a big Purdue Boilermaker fan. And our coach got COVID-19. And last year, he seemed to be with it in terms of his play calling. And I told my wife this after he got COVID-19 and he came back on the sidelines. I mean, some of the plays he called just seemed like, well, what is he doing? Just didn't seem within his character. And in retrospect, I believe it had affected his brain. I can tell you this personally from my own personal exposure. My sister got the COVID and ended up in the hospital. And, after she got out of the hospital, she didn't see herself for about 6 months. And I blamed it on the death of my stepfather and my mom. But in retrospect, I believe she had the brain fog from COVID-19. And then intermittent fever and palpitations. But that's not the only story. So it can also cause long-term organ damage. And we talked about the myocarditis to the point that if you get damage to your heart, it can affect you. So if you're a young, athletic person, and your body can compensate. But as you get older, this damage will become more evident. And there's a lot of studies now showing that people are dying of congestive heart failure at younger ages, kids, teenagers, young adults, because they had myocarditis, which was not picked up. Then we can see permanent lung damage, what people talked about, kidney failure, hair loss, rashes, and we've talked about the neurologic. And then one of the unsuspecting aspects of it is also depression, anxiety, and changes in mood, which a lot of people have said is because of the stay-at-home order and the pandemic and things like that. But yeah, it's the pandemic, but it may also be COVID affecting your neurologic symptom in your brain. So these are things we need to keep in mind, whether you ask yourself, should I take the vaccine or not? Because if you take the vaccine, you may prevent yourself not only from dying, but also having these long-term effects. So are folks then really asymptomatic? And my question is, or is the damage that has been done, we just haven't seen yet, And so I said this before, many people are infected with COVID-19, may have symptoms or illness that they don't even contribute to the COVID-19, but may be the result of that, okay? And so my stepfather, 43 years, died of COVID-19. And I remember when he went in the hospital, he didn't die of the pulmonary part. He had heart failure, and he died of heart failure. And my stepbrother to this day says, when he died of heart failure, he did not die of COVID-19. No, he died of COVID-19, which caused his heart failure. Okay, and on the doctors on this death certificate, they put COVID-19, and that was correct. Secondary was heart failure. So are people really asymptomatic and have they really recovered? That's a question that we have to ask ourselves. And the only answer we'll know is time will tell. But there's one thing for sure. We need to protect ourselves and we need to protect our loved ones. So next, I want to put this up here because I want to give a shout out to the Ohio State University Wexner Medical Center, because they did this study back in August, and this is the physician, Dr. Raj Paul, who looked at athletes who had tested positive for COVID and had, quote, recovered. So he, being a researcher, he did MRI studies, and he found that 15% of recovered, there's the word, recovered athletes who had tested positive and, quote, had recovered, actually had ongoing myocarditis, which we call cardiac inflammation or swelling of the heart, okay? And so Ohio State put in protocols that if you get COVID, they put you through a cardiac protocol, and if you don't, pass the MRI test, you can't play. Now, I thought this was interesting, just to throw a little SEC in there. At Vanderbilt, this is a woman whose child was a basketball player on the Vanderbilt basketball team, and young lady, and she got COVID. And then they did an MRI, but they were thinking about letting her play again. And the MRI showed she had myocarditis, and they held her out. And the young lady's mom said, this MRI basically saved my life. And this is a recent article, okay? So it's 12/31/20. And the article says, why aren't all college athletes with COVID-19 getting MRI exams? And at some university, they're not doing them. And I think they should. At the Big Ten and probably the SEC, they probably are, as you can see from Vanderbilt and OSU. But others need to check this. Otherwise, we will have young people who will die later from this and may not even know. So next, so those are some things I just want to give you an update on the disease, because the disease has gone beyond just thinking of lungs and people dying. We have these long-term effects. So next, I'd like to talk a little bit about the vaccine development, okay? The Bible says there's nothing new under the sun. I just want to let you know that there's a lot of misinformation that, oh, this vaccine just came up within this past year. Well, no, it didn't just happen this past year. And so one of the things is that back when I showed you that slide about in Singapore in 2003, when they had COVID-1, the people in Singapore and in China and Taiwan actually started looking at a vaccine back then. And the first vaccines are usually tested in animals. So back in 2003, they had produced vaccines against various coronaviruses in birds. I remember it came from bats, in dogs, and in cats. So they actually had a prototype of a vaccine in Singapore and China, and probably Taiwan, about looking at, and that's how you start off with vaccine or any drug development. You look at animals first, then you move to humans. So there was an animal vaccine that goes back to 2003, 17 years ago. And I heard a Black physician talk about this from Cincinnati, and she was right when she said they've been working on this vaccine for 17 years. So it's not just this past year. And then as a result, in the Middle East with the Saudi Arabians, as we know, Saudi Arabia has a lot of capital and they can do a lot of things. So they also looked at it, and that was back in 2016. And I want you to keep that date in your head. And so back in 2005, 2006, 2003, there are a lot of countries that had kind of put this thing on their priority list in terms of public health. And even the World Health Organization had looked at this, because they said that this bad boy, if it gets out and it spreads, it could be pretty serious. Unfortunately, within the United States, we did not take it seriously back in 2005 and 6, because, since it wasn't in the United States, we didn't pay attention to it. But that changed. So the Bible says, once again, there's nothing new under the sun. And when you hear that it just occurred this past year, that's not true. It's been around, as you can see, going all the way back to 2003. And I've already mentioned this. A lot of the preliminary vaccine knowledge that was established and maintained by the World Health Organization. That's what WHO stands for, and somewhat at the NIH. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And so when we pulled out of the World Health Organization earlier this past 2020, it's one of the worst things we could have done in terms of getting this pandemic under control, because the World Health Organization had a lot of information from 2003 when it was COVID-1, and then the MERS in 2012. And so what you do is you build on that knowledge set. And when we pulled out of the World Health Organization, thank God there were some scientists that continued to share information with the scientists here in the US, but our government pulled out, which put us, if I can say, at risk. So the other thing is vaccine development in the United States is a very bureaucratic process. It's a slow process, and it's a political process, okay? And so most vaccine developments take somewhere between 6 to 10 years. And that's not because we don't necessarily have the technology, but it's just trying to get through the bureaucracy. So as I already mentioned, there was already work on the vaccine that dates back to 2003, 2012. But the nice thing about this is over those period of times, we developed what we call these technology platforms for vaccine development. And that's what actually helped us to speed things forward. So for those of you, I still have an iPhone 6, 12 is out. When I bought my 6 3 years ago, I'm way behind the time because there's 6 new versions of the iPhone. So when you think about vaccine development and platforms, technology platforms and drug development, you need to think about it that way, because in the span of 6 years, a lot can happen in medical development. So I put this down here just to say, therefore, the foundation of the current vaccine attempts were laid 17 years ago, and you have the data to prove it. So just a little bit about how vaccines are developed, and just particularly this COVID vaccine. So we already talked about that usually vaccine development occurs in animals first, and then once they get proof of principle in animals, then they move to what we call phase 1. And phase 1 is where they look at safety and dosing of the vaccine in healthy individuals. So there are some healthy individuals who actually volunteered to take these 2 messenger RNA vaccines before they made it to the phase 3 clinical trials. So in phase 1, that's how we have some safety data, and they talk about the safety of the vaccine because some brave souls during their, in the phase 1 and phase 2 volunteered. They didn't have COVID, they just volunteered so they could look at the side effects only, and then the doses. And then what you'll hear about is the phase 3 studies, which is the big clinical trials. Moderna's, is over 40,000, and Pfizer is over 30,000, and I may have those numbers reversed, but together it was over 70,000, and those are the phase 3 studies. So by the time you get the phase 3 studies, over thousands of people have been exposed to the vaccine, and you have what we call early safety data. And then once you get to phase 4, which is the pivotal studies to say whether it works or not, based upon giving it to healthy people and giving it to people with who are at risk for COVID, then you can tell whether or not it's going to do its job. And then it used to be you'd move into phase 4, which would be approval or continued safety studies. But because of COVID is, as you can see from the numbers, has expanded in terms of morbidity and mortality, we had to get emergency use authorization, which is still not total approval, but we couldn't wait on total approval because that would be like 6 months down the road, and we can't afford to wait. So how do vaccines work? Real quickly, this is an easy slide. Old vaccines like mumps, measles, polio vaccine were usually what we call attenuated vaccines, attenuated viruses vaccine, where they took the live virus and they weakened it, then they injected you with a weakened live virus, or they call it an attenuated virus. Then your body produces antibodies against the virus and kills the virus. That's not how COVID viruses are been developed. So you will not be injected with an attenuated or weakened COVID virus. So I know there's information out there that says talking about, but that's not true. With our current technology, and I'll show you that shortly, we don't do it that way anymore. But the nice thing about it is once you get exposed to something that produces immunity to the virus, then your body has these things called memory cells. And then we have these things called B cells and T cells, and these things called T helper cells, which help to remind the B cells of memory to produce antibodies to fight the disease. So once you get exposed, or once you get the vaccine, your body will say, when it comes to you, it'll say, oh, I have seen this before. This is a bad thing. We need to fight against that. And that's when it talks about forming memory cells. So that's the basic And so I'm going to just real quickly go over what we call vaccine platforms, because I think you need to be knowledgeable about when you hear this. This has revolutionized vaccine development. So this is the electronic picture of the virus, and I'm going to not try to turn you into scientists, but I want you to have plenty of knowledge. And I also apologize for the length of this um, talk, because I just want to make sure you have the information you know. So these little red things here are called spike proteins, and I'm going to talk about this. These little red things here are spike proteins, and that's what the antibodies will be developed against. And I'll also explain to you why that's important. And then within the virus, viruses are basically protein and messenger RNA. So within the virus itself, you have this messenger RNA. And this is the heart and soul of the virus. So the messenger RNA is what tells the virus to produce these spike proteins. It tells it to produce the membranes, envelopes. But within the messenger RNA, you can tease out aspects of the messenger RNA where the only thing the messenger RNA will produce is a spike protein. And the spike protein is real important. So I just want to give you that as a background. So these are the different platforms. And I'm not trying to turn you into scientists, but the messenger RNA viruses that are out there now are based upon this messenger RNA platform, which is messenger RNA within the cells. But there's other vaccines out there that will be based upon viral particles, based upon the membranes, or a combination thereof of the membrane and the stalks, which will help us produce antibodies against this. But right now, the vaccines that we have now is based upon this messenger RNA platform. So I put this up there only just to not to confuse anybody, but when they looked at vaccines for COVID-2, they've looked at inactivated SARS viruses to see if that might be a way to go. To be honest with you, I'm not so sure that's going to be the way to go, but that's old school, and you got to look at old school. But it says inactivated. Inactivated basically means killed virus. Okay. Then there's a recombinant protein vaccines, which is basically where they've taken parts of this spike protein and broken it down in the various aspects of a protein, and then your body will produce antibodies against this. And then there's what we call viral vectors. The vector is what carries the messenger RNA. And then the messenger RNA vaccines, which is this one here, where you will tease out part of the messenger RNA within the virus that will produce this spike protein, which antibodies will produce and then prevent it from going into the cell. And then the DNA vaccines, they're working on DNA vaccines as well, and that's the AstraZeneca one. So just real quickly how this works. So this is how the virus attacks your body. So with this spike protein that I talked about, which is on the edge of these cells, what happens is in your lungs, we have these things called ACE2 receptors. And so the virus with the spike protein combines with its receptor in your lungs, then it enters your lung cell, then it releases its messenger RNA. Its messenger RNA goes through what they call this endoplasmic reticulum, or Golgi apparatus, big fancy word, which is basically the assembly line and the manufacturing facility that the messenger RNA tells your body to produce more of the COVID. So the COVID takes advantage of your body's machinery apparatus and reproduces itself. And that's why you get the high fevers, arthralgias, and they do all this in the lungs. That's why I showed you the picture where it just wipes out your lungs. And so that's what the virus does. It's very smart. Okay, it takes over your body and reproduces itself with its messenger RNA. And so what messenger RNA vaccines do is they tease out the aspect of the messenger RNA that only produces the spike protein. And then when the spike protein shows up, it doesn't reproduce the virus, it reproduces the spike protein. So what happens when the spike protein ends up in your bloodstream? Your immune system sees the spike protein and says, this is not part of me. We need to kill this sucker, okay? And then it sends out antibodies, and the antibodies attack the spike protein. And why is that important? Because then what happens is, and I'm ahead of myself, but this is basically what I talked about. The spike protein, messenger RNA instructed to make more of these spike proteins, and then your body produces these antibodies. And then what happens is, when your body produces this antibody, it blocks these spike proteins and it prevents the virus from entering your cells. So your body produces these antibodies to the spike protein, attaches to the spike protein, and then it prevents the virus from entering your cells, taking over your cells and producing more of the virus. So this type of platform, as you can notice from the data, is about 95% effective. And the other thing about this, it's basically stimulating your own body to be much more aggressive in fighting off disease. The messenger RNA that produces these spike proteins only produce the spike protein. It does not produce the virus, reproduce the virus. And that's really significant. The other thing about these messenger RNA vaccines is the messenger RNA is very fragile. And therefore, if it leaks out into your cells where it doesn't need to be, your body produces antibodies against the messenger RNA and removes it from your body as well. So not only does your body produce antibodies against the spike, but it produces antibodies against the messenger RNA. And over a period of time, it removes that messenger RNA so that it cannot hang around. But the fact that these antibodies that your body produces prevents the virus from going into the cells is very, very novel and very important. Some of the platforms that I've talked about is the viral vector platform, the messenger RNA-based platform, which we already know that two of them are already out there. We talked a little bit about the inactivated virus. This one here is probably, with all of the information and stuff and the technology you have with the RNA-based platforms and the viral vector and the DNA-based ones, you probably won't see this one, even though they said there's three. And then this is the one that we talked about, how polio and measles and mumps vaccines used to be produced with a live attenuated virus. As you can see, there were 4 candidates, but none of them have made it to clinical trials. And I doubt very seriously that they will, because no one wants to take a chance of injecting live coronavirus in anybody. That isn't, not when you have other platforms which make more sense and have been much more effective and are much safer. So you'll hear people saying, oh, they're injecting viruses. No, the messenger RNA viruses vaccines are totally different. And I hope I've explained that well. So I just want to talk a little bit about Dr. Corbett, because once again, I want to go back to talk about the fact that this is not anything new. So when Dr. Fauci said, and I'm going to give him credit, that he gave the sister some credit. And oftentimes African Americans have made significant contributions in medical science and they don't get credit. But he said, to my African American brothers and sisters, this vaccine that you're going to be taking was developed by an African American woman, and that's a fact. And it is a fact, okay? So back in March, when this thing first hit in 2020, remember I talked about phase 1 clinical trials. Less than 2 weeks after the president's briefing on this, okay, they had already developed a vaccine for phase 1 clinical trials. Phase 1 clinical trials is where you give the vaccine to healthy people for safety reasons, okay? And for the past 6 years, so if you subtract 6 from 20, since 2014, she has been working on this coronavirus biology and the vaccine development. And her team was the first one to come up with a spike protein, which was the basis of the current vaccines. So she has been central to the development of this current messenger RNA vaccine, but I want you to keep the date in mind. So what was happening in 2014? Well, the Saudi Arabians had gotten COVID, and that was in 2013. Singapore and China in 2003. So when this young sister came on the scene in 2014, she didn't ignore the science from the World Health Organization or from Singapore or Saudi Arabia. She got on it because the Obama administration, and this is not a political talk, had already looked and said, something is coming down the pike. We don't know what it's going to be, but we need to have some resources in case it gets here. So she's been working on this thing since 2014, 6 years. And this was her comment back in March of 2020 when they asked her opinion. And she says at that lecture in 2020, she said, I'd like to call it plug and play approach. But the basic idea is that we have so much knowledge based on previously done work, i.e. previously done work in her lab, by ourselves and other labs, World Health Organization's lab, that we were able to pull the trigger on vaccine development, start the ball rolling with a phase 1 clinical trial back in March 2020. So when you hear that, oh, this thing just showed up in 2020, no, this sister's been working this thing since 2014. The Chinese, the Singaporeans, the Saudi Arabians, prior to that, just that this sister had come up with the ideal that kind of made this work. So I'm going to talk about Moderna a little bit. Moderna is a small biopharmaceutical company in Boston. They did not have the technology nor the resources to make this thing happen. She works at the NIH. The government chipped in $2.5 billion to work with Moderna, but don't kid yourself. So she was a major part of Moderna being able to ramp this thing up and getting it out very fast because of the previous work that she had done behind the scenes over the past 6 years. And I just put this in here because, there's nothing new under the sun. You recognize some of the players. Here she is in her lab talking about her research, and we know who this is, and I'll leave it at that. So some of the most, you'll hear about different vaccines that are coming out. You already know about Moderna's vaccine, and it's about 95% effective. Pfizer BioNTech is 95% effective. I put this up here because you've not heard of this, but if you know about Sputnik, for those of us who are older, Sputnik was a satellite that came out of Russia. This is a Russian institute, okay? And they say it's 92% effective, but a lot of the scientists in the US and around the world question this efficacy, okay? So the only reason I put that in there is because you've heard that possibly AstraZeneca's vaccine will be coming out in April, and it's about 70% effective, but you might not hear much about this, or you may. But this is a Russian vaccine, and there's a lot of questions about whether this figure will pass the smell test. But these other studies, the other ones are in the US, Great Britain, and other well-established countries. And so I just leave you at that. So we've talked a little bit about this already, and I'm just going to reiterate that these vaccines are held to very high safety standards. In phase 1, brave souls decide to take it. And then phase 2, you have others who decide to take it who are not sick. And then you get into the phase 3 studies, which is the big trials that everybody. And then I mentioned that usually they get approved in phase 4, but we have so many people who are being affected. We know about the long-term side effects in terms of the organ damage and blood clots, that the emergency use authorization, we couldn't wait till phase 4. Too many people would die, as you've seen from the figures I presented earlier. So by the numbers, you also hear data that says, well, there weren't enough African Americans in these studies. Well, that's not true. Just that the number was not as high as, so we represent about, African Americans represent about 13% of the population. And so in these studies, there was about 10%. So 10% in the Pfizer studies African Americans participate in the trials, and 10% in the Moderna trial. So it's not as low as you would be led to believe. And so the other thing is I actually looked at the raw data on the Moderna vaccine, and it was interesting to date, and the data I looked at, out of all of the African Americans who got the vaccine, only one got the COVID virus. So, which was interesting versus the placebo arm where they didn't get the vaccine, a lot more African Americans got the virus. And I thought that was interesting that only one in the controlled arm of the study, the Moderna trial, got the virus out of all the others who got the vaccine. So I thought that was very impressive. And once again, they looked at it in different age groups, which is very important. So side effects, let's talk about side effects. So yes, the vaccines do have side effects, but in this case, most will have mild side effects, and it's an indication that the vaccine is working, okay? The vaccine is designed to teach your body how to fight the coronavirus, okay? And that's why I went through all that stuff about the vaccine producing antibodies, and antibodies is immune response, and people who have immune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis and lupus, they have joint pain and muscle pain. That's because their immune system is hyperactive. So when you stimulate the immune system, some joint pain, muscle pain, fatigue, and a fever is part of the fact that your immune system is doing what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to be producing these antibodies, which is not normally in the system, which is to fight off the infection. So when you first get the vaccine, you should have some of those symptoms, and some people's bodies are so robust they won't, but it shouldn't be anything that's unexpected. And so, like it says, as the side effects are the result of a normal, healthy immune system responding to the vaccine, and it's administered to boost your immune response, as we talked about. Side effects do not mean that you have COVID, and I just talked to you about why that means that, because you are not being injected with the virus. So there's no way you can get the virus from the vaccine. It's just not medically possible. And that's why I went over the different platforms and stuff. Okay. Most people do not have serious problems. There are some people in the data that show that if you have a lot of allergies and you have a hyperimmune system, then in those individuals, the immune system is kind of exaggerated. For example, some of the cases where people got into trouble in England, one guy got into trouble because he was carrying an EpiPen. So he must have had a lot of allergies. If you're carrying an EpiPen, that means that you got a lot of allergies, and you got the vaccine, you probably should get the vaccine someplace where people are going to be observing you to see how you do over a period of time. But that means that his immune system was jacked up, okay? And probably in those individuals needs to be a lot more observation and serious consideration. But most people don't have most people are not walking around with an EpiPen, okay? So most people should be okay. Um, I've talked a little bit about the side effects already, in vaccines, but COVID's vaccine side effects, the biggest one actually is where you get the shot. So when you get the shot in your shoulder muscles, you have a lot of pain and swelling. So I joined the Medicare group this past year, and I got my first pneumovax, which is a vaccine against pneumonia. It lasts 5 years, and after I got it, my arm hurt for about 2 days. But that told me that the thing was working. So I'm pretty protected from hopefully pneumococcal pneumonia for the next 5 years. But some of the symptoms we've talked about: fever, fatigue, headache, muscle pain, chills, joint pain, that suggests that the vaccine is stimulating antibodies, stimulating your immune system, and that's what we expect to see. And so in most cases, when I got my pneumovax vaccine, I sit over at the Kroger's for 15 minutes, walked around the store, bought some stuff, and then after that, I left and had some muscle pain in my shoulder. But otherwise, I did pretty well. And that's why they monitor you for about 15 minutes after you would get the vaccine to make sure you do not have an immediate reaction. Those who have anaphylactic reactions or a jacked up immune system, once they get the vaccine, you will know within 30 minutes or an hour whether or not you're going to respond totally adversely from this vaccine. And then they say most side effects happen within the first 3 days and usually last 1 or 2 days. And that's very common. Those are the symptoms from the vaccine. To date, we have not seen any other symptoms. And I talked about that earlier, about the fragility of the messenger RNA component of these vaccines, because that messenger RNA is very fragile. And if it gets into your bloodstream, it'll be broken down quickly by your body and by your antibodies against it. So once it gets into the cell, produces a spike protein, your body pretty much eliminates the messenger RNA, which is really good. So the question you might have is there one vaccine that has more side effects than others between the Pfizer and the Moderna? So preliminary data suggests that the Pfizer has less side effects than the Moderna vaccines, but it's early on and a lot of people still are getting it. So I suspect the side effect profile will kind of even up. But once again, the top two side effects are pain in the injection site and the fatigue. They usually wear off after a couple of days. And then if you would list the top three beyond these two symptoms, Moderna's vaccine usually has headaches, muscle pain, joint pains, and chills. Pfizer's uses headaches, once again, then muscle pain and chills. And so they're very similar because they're both messenger RNA based. So I put this up here also just to show you the ingredients of the Pfizer vaccine. And the Moderna vaccine ingredients is basically the same. So it is basically just messenger RNA, a slice of the messenger RNA that produces the spike protein, which is what your body will produce antibodies against. Then it has these things called lipids, because the lipids attach to the messenger RNA, and the lipids are basically just fat, okay? They keep the messenger RNA from breaking down because it's so fragile. Then potassium chloride, which is basically sea salt, potassium phosphate, sodium chloride, which is this basic salt, biphasic sodium phosphate dehydrate, which is another form of a salt, which are basically, to keep the vaccine and the lipids, from degrading. And then sucrose is a sweetener. It's a form of a glucose, which we all use in. It's either Equal or Splenda. I can't remember. But these are basically the ingredients. There are no preservatives. There's no attenuated virus, and there's no egg whites or anything like that that we use with other vaccine development. And this is pretty basic. This is the other reason why they say when you open that virus vial and give the virus, you have to give it within 6 hours. Okay, 6 hours. Otherwise, the virus breaks, I mean, the messenger RNA breaks down and it becomes incapacitated. Okay. And that's why that you probably read about the case of the pharmacist up in Wisconsin, and he destroyed 500 vials of Moderna. Okay. And the only thing he did was he didn't put it in the refrigerator. He just left it out. Okay. And that destroyed. So that tells you how fragile this messenger RNA is. Um, and they talk about, it have to be stored at certain temperatures and stuff because it's very fragile, and there's no preservatives in this. Otherwise, people would have allergic reactions to preservatives, and there's none in there. So I talked a little bit about this. Can I get COVID if I have a history of a severe allergic reaction? If you have a history of a severe allergic reaction not related to the vaccines, you can still get a vaccine, but you should be monitored. We talked about that. If you've had severe allergic reaction to other vaccines, it's important you talk to your doctor. He will have your history and he'll help you make that decision. And I said, if you've ever had a severe allergic reaction to any ingredient in the COVID vaccine, which is highly unlikely since most of them are salts and lipids, then people will help you to make that decision. But that's very unusual. A little bit about kids. The vaccines were tested, and one was tested in 16 and older, and one was tested in 18 and older. So kids right now are not probably going to receive the vaccine because we have not tested the vaccine in children. And it may not be recommended for certain individuals with certain health conditions, like if you are allergic to multiple things, it may not be a good idea for you because that means your immune system might be jacked up, or if you get the vaccine, you may need to be monitored. Once again, your doctor will know what's best for you. We still don't know about certain rheumatic disease. I am a rheumatologist, treated a lot of lupus patients, and I can tell you when vaccines for pneumococcus came out and influenza, I wanted to wait until I saw how those patients who had lupus and rheumatoid arthritis responded to those vaccines before I would recommend it to my lupus patients. I think, the jury is still out on this. So if you have an autoimmune disorder, and depending on what the autoimmune disorder is, I think most patients with autoimmune disorders can take the vaccine if their autoimmune disorder is under control, and probably also if they're not on certain drugs. But that's a decision that will be best made with you and your doctor. There's been no studies to date in pregnant and nursing women. People ask, well, should pregnant and nursing women? There's a lot of discussion out there that they say they should. Some people say they shouldn't. There's no studies at this time. And in my opinion, as a scientist, if there's been no studies and we don't have data, then we probably should wait till we have data that tell us one way or the other. However, if you have the typical diseases that a lot of us do, who are African American, diabetes, hypertension, COPD, heart disease, then we should get the vaccine. These are not autoimmune diseases in the sense that we think of autoimmune diseases. So, and we do know that if you have diabetes, hypertension, then it predisposes you to death from COVID or some of the long-term effects. Long-term effects of the vaccines, one of the things that the CDC and the FDA have is what they call a data safety monitoring board. We now have about 6 months of safety data, which is pretty good for vaccine development. And as the months go by, and if you remember, they did their phase 1 studies actually back in March. Phase 1 study started. And so those people are still being monitored, healthy individuals who got the vaccine, those who were sick and got the vaccine, so we're now collected probably about 9 months of safety data. So that's why you hear people say it's safe. And based upon that 9 months, we've got a lot of data now you can look at and say, okay, so nothing untoward has happened in that 9 months. And usually within 9 months, if you were going to get Guillain-Barré, it's going to get something else, it probably would have popped up by now. If this had been 6 weeks, it's one thing, but 6 months or greater. But this data safety monitoring board is a board of the FDA. Most of you don't know, but I did medical research at DuPont back when I was a young man. And I remember I used to hate to go before the Data Safety Monitoring Board at the FDA because they'd nitpicked on a lot of stuff. Okay, they were, they were always just, what is this? What is this? Okay, oh, explain this and this and this. And so when I was a young man, I was going before the Data Safety Monitoring Board. I thought they were a little bit too picky, But now that with the vaccine, we want them to be picky. This is an independent board. These are independent physicians who work as consultants to the FDA, but not consultants in the sense of telling the FDA what to do. Their whole job is to basically make sure the FDA is doing their job and looking under all the nooks and crannies for safety. And this is a process that goes on with all vaccines. But once again, we're still learning about vaccines, and things will come up that we won't anticipate. So this is kind of a summary slide, and I'd ask whoever's got that, please mute your mic. That I've already talked about in pretty much detail. And once again, both of these vaccines will require 2 doses. You've heard some things in the news telling people that, oh, maybe you can get by with half a dose or just 1 dose. No, it won't be effective, because the reason why it's effective is you give 1 dose, which primes your immune system, gets it ready, and then you get that second dose, which really gets you at that 95%. So if you get the first dose, and that's the only dose you get, it'll only be effective maybe at 53%. I saw some data like that, or even questionable whether it'd be effective at all. But that first dose, it's a primer for your immune system. And that second dose is what crosses the finish line and helps you become immune. So I just want to put this up here. We like to be #1 in the United States, but Canada, Great Britain, and Saudi Arabia had already approved it for emergency use. Are you surprised that Saudi Arabia did it? I'm not. They had been there and done. They had already been there in 2013. So they'd seen COVID in a different form, and they knew about it. So when the vaccine came out, Saudi Arabia jumped on it because they knew what they were dealing with. Canada and Great Britain, we won't go there where they're smarter than we are, but they've already approved it, and we're fourth in that regard. Just a little bit about vaccine distribution. I put this up here. I've talked a little bit about herd immunity already. We do not want to get to herd immunity through a natural approach, and I presented those mortality numbers to get you to understand why that's not a good idea. But if you get vaccinated, and then for those who get infected, between those who get naturally infected and those get vaccinated, we can get up to about 90% of what we call exposure in medicine. And therefore, between those who are vaccinated, decreasing the transmission, and especially those who are asymptomatic, who get the vaccine before they're asymptomatic, become asymptomatic spreaders, and then those who have natural immunity, between the two combined, we can get this thing under control. And so that's when you'll hear this. But the old concept of herd immunity, where you just let nature take its course, too many people will die. Not only people will die, but there'll be a lot of long-term side effects that we don't want to have people left with. In terms of the distribution, I'm not going to get into the politics, but healthcare workers, right now I can tell you at Mount Carmel, where I serve on one of their boards, we've vaccinated about 7,000 of our employees, and we only have about 8,500 employees. So, and I know Ohio Health and Ohio State are vaccinating their employees. I see their information. So the healthcare workers are definitely getting it first. And to be honest with you, we need them to get it because we need them to be alive. Somebody to take care of us if we get into issues. And then after that, talk about long-term care facility, because one of the things no one talks about is when you look at this 350 some thousand of deaths, about 120,000 of those deaths occur in older individuals or people who are in long-term care facilities. And so they are being affected a lot more than everybody else, both Black and white and Hispanic. So that's why you see the long-term facilities. And then individuals over 75, and I'm not going to read this because, where there's going through a process now where we're starting to ask the question, is maybe some of these things in terms of who gets it and when may be shifted. Essential healthcare workers, which is a lot of African Americans on the front line, maybe people who drive the school bus, people who drive public transportation, people who work on the front lines in environmental services, you know, especially if you're working in environmental services at Mount Carmel or Ohio Health, and you're going into the ICU and cleaning up the room after a COVID patient has died. I think those individuals should be here in the healthcare. They should get the vaccine because we need all those folks. And so there's a lot of discussion, but this is just the planned rollout. So the vaccine will help your immune system, as we talked about, against the virus. Some people who get the vaccine may still get the virus, but they'll get a milder form. And hopefully they'll get a form that won't be transmissible. But if you get the vaccine, it'll protect you from getting the virus. Then you're going to protect a lot of people, not only yourself, but your family, your coworkers and patients. And you've heard all this before. In the Bible, it tells us that we should look out after others more than ourselves. And I think by getting the vaccine, this is a biblical concept. You know, I should be thinking of someone else besides myself. You know, it bothers me when I hear people say, well, I didn't get it or I got it and I'm okay. And then they run out without a mask and other things. They still could be symptomatic, asymptomatic spreaders, and they're only thinking of themselves, and that's not a Christian value. So I just want to leave you with this. So God is smarter than us. The leprosy was the COVID-19 of the day in the Old Testament. And if you want to get, there's 2 chapters on it, in Leviticus 13, Leviticus 14. And God laid out the law of what you should do with patients you recognize with leprosy, and then the ritual of cleansing the healed leper. So he also laid out the law. What should you do with people who have gotten leprosy and gotten over it? Okay. So that's with COVID, you know, take care of people who got COVID, but this is what we should do with people who have recovered from COVID. And so God was ahead of his time, and he actually called this the law of leprosy. There's nothing new under the sun. So I just put this up here. This is Fauci. He's got the Moderna vaccine. Biden got the Moderna vaccine. And I just think this shows leadership. And to be honest with you, both of these guys should have gotten it because he's 79. I think he's 78. And so I just want to complete that verse in 1 Thessalonians 5:29. It says, test all things, but hold fast to what is good. So I hope I've given you enough information that you can make your own educated decision about this. And I'll stop there and now entertain any questions. And I apologize for the length of this, but I just wanted you to have enough information to be able to make an educated decision. Thank you.
Dr. Sanders, this is Tony Marshall. I do have a quick question for you, please, sir.
Sure.
First, thank you so much for sharing this. This has been so informative to not only me, but it looks like from the comments to everyone. But the question I have for you is, what is the impact of the vaccination on those people that are asymptomatic, meaning that they've had the COVID and that they have antibodies? So does that help them, hurt them, or does it not have any impact at all?
Okay, so let me repeat your question. So what you're asking is that if you've already gotten COVID and you got the antibodies, if you get the vaccine, will that hurt you or help you? Is that right?
Right, or not have any impact at all.
Now, okay, so what it will do is it will help you. Okay, so basically when you get the disease, your body produces these antibodies. Okay, and then what the vaccine does is when you get the vaccine, your body sees the spike protein again, and then it just pushes more antibodies out into your stream. So it actually augments your antibody response. So it actually helps you. And that's why you hear the question come up, if I've already been infected and I got antibodies, should I get the vaccine? And the answer to that is yes, you should, because it'll protect you even more.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Brother Sanders, we do have a few questions that were posted in the chat.
Okay, let me see if I can.
I can
read them?
Yeah, I can read them for you. Not a problem. We have a question that says, are there any other forms of treatment being developed? I'm guessing for the vaccine, like i.e. Like pill form or anything else like that?
No, not at this time. You've heard information about hydroxychloroquine that came out earlier in the year. But all the studies that I've seen, and there's been about 7 studies about hydroxychloroquine being protective and things like that, and the studies have not bore that out. So I saw studies that people got hydroxychloroquine as preventative. They've gotten it while they had the disease, and then they got it after they got over the illness. And all the studies do not bore out that hydroxychloroquine has a positive effect on that. So there's no pills right now that are in development, to my knowledge, nor that are out there that are going to make a difference. Now, let me talk a little bit about vitamin D, though. Vitamin D, though, there's studies that are now coming out suggesting that vitamin D has a positive impact in regards to not preventing COVID-19, but it helps augment your immune system. And so if you get the COVID, there's some studies that suggest that it might alleviate some of your symptoms and may help you in regards to augmenting your immune system. And a lot of us African Americans are vitamin D deficient. I was vitamin D deficient, and I was vitamin D deficient, and I need to get on vitamin D, and I'm taking about 10,000 units a day. For some reason, I just don't respond to it. But vitamin D is one that helps. Vitamin C, okay. Linus Pauling talked about this decades ago. We didn't have the technology to prove it, but vitamin C helps promote your immune system as well. And it doesn't prevent COVID, so don't run out saying that. But it just helps augment your immune system. So vitamin C, vitamin D, particularly D3, is beneficial regardless of whether you have COVID or not.
All right, there's another question.
So I have a question. Someone asked about, does China have a vaccine?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
Okay. Yes, so China does have a vaccine. But the Chinese are very secretive, and the Chinese also look after their own, which is nothing wrong with that. So they're vaccinating their people with their vaccine. I have not seen the data on their vaccine yet, but they claim that it's efficacious. But in China, there's a lot of people, but they do have a vaccine, and I haven't seen a lot of data on that. And the Chinese are not very good at sharing their data in that regard, because they've got billions of people, but they do have a vaccine. And I mentioned Russia has a vaccine. Matter of fact, I put it on the screen. Russia claims it's 92% effective. There's a lot of scientists in the United States and in the European Union who question this data, and we should. This is not a political statement, but you can't always trust some things that in other countries. You got to have proof of principle, and you've got to share your data. That's the importance of the World Health Organization. And the World Health Organization, there's been some criticism of China and the World Health Organization, but Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, other countries, France, they share their information with the World Health Organization. People put their heads together, and that's how you come up with a lot of these things. Just to let you know, the Pfizer vaccine was developed in a German company, but the German company did not have the wherewithal to be able to ramp it up. And that's why Pfizer, which is a US pharmaceutical company, came on board. So it's really not Pfizer's vaccine alone. A German biotech firm, that's why you see that Genentech on the end, came up with it first. Now, Moderna is strictly a US vaccine. Moderna is I think it's in Boston. And then I showed you about Dr. Colbert and the NIH. So they combined and came up with the Moderna vaccine. And then the AstraZeneca vaccine, which I mentioned, is a DNA vaccine, which we can talk about. I can come back later and update you on that. But if it comes out, it'll come out in April, and it's a United Kingdom vaccine. So there'll be a lot of scrutiny, a lot of eyes on that. Another question I got is, are the side effects in blacks and whites the same? And the answer to that is yes. Yes.
There was another question that said, the question is, based on how viruses mutate, Does research show how effective the vaccine is for a known mutation?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So, lately you've been hearing about this variant and this, there's been some concern about it spreading throughout the United States. That's because of the mutation within the virus. But the one thing that probably mutates the least amount is that spike protein. So one of the reasons I gave you that long talk about the spike protein is because the spike protein has to attach to what we call your ACE and receptors. Okay, so it's not that spike protein is not going to change that much. Otherwise, it can't get into your cells and replicate itself. So a lot of the other viral aspects of the virus may change. The surface membrane, some of the viral vectors, and other components. But that spike protein, if it changes too much, it decreases the infectivity of the virus. Or like one of the things they've noticed is that it has the spike protein has changed a little bit, so to try to become more efficacious in terms of getting in your cells. But but that change has actually made it more susceptible to the vaccines. So that's why the messenger RNA um, technology platform is at 95%, and that's why you hear people talk about that the current vaccines they think will be efficacious against this new variant, because the key to the virus is that spike protein. If it changes too much, it can't get into your cells, and the virus needs to get into your cells to be um, efficacious and to reproduce itself. But that's why some of the other technologies, the viral envelope and stuff like that, when you make vaccines against those type of things, you sometimes you have to change the vaccine on a year-to-year basis. But for those of you like myself who get influenza vaccines every year, that's why we get a shot every year, is because the influenza virus changes and it doesn't have a spike protein and stuff like that. So I hope that makes sense. But right now they're thinking, based upon our knowledge base, that the current vaccines the messenger RNA will protect us against these variants.
So then there's another question here. It says, any value to homeopathic treatments like one used toward the end of the pandemic flu in 1918, zinc, vitamin D, vitamin C, I believe that's oscillococcinum. I don't know how to say that. But yeah, that's the question.
I don't know, is that what so I've already talked about vitamin C and vitamin D. Yes, those are helpful. And even after the pandemic, you should be taking vitamin D and vitamin C, especially as Black people, because we have a lot of Black people who are vitamin D deficient. So that helps, and vitamin C. But in terms of the other homeopathic medications, no, there's no data to prove that those are efficacious. Now, there are 3 things that you can do to help yourself. And it's sort of like, not to be a preacher, but I can't remember when God told him go down and dump yourself into Jordan and you'll be healed. So wear a mask. There's a lot of data out there that suggests that if you wear a mask, you're protecting yourself, and it's actually more efficacious than the vaccine. But if you get the vaccine and wear a mask, then that's double help. The other thing is to eat right. Okay, so if you want to do something, eat natural foods. Okay, and stay away from the junk food. And if you work for McDonald's, I apologize, but right now, eating natural foods, lots of vegetables, drinking plenty of water, nuts, fruits, just a good diet. The other thing is sleep. 7 to 8 hours of sleep. And that's a struggle for me. But what happens when you go to sleep, it regenerates your body, it regenerates your immune system. Then the other thing that helps is exercise. 150 minutes a day. Everybody asks the question, well, why? Because when you exercise, you increase your blood flow to all of your organs. And your blood flow is how those antibodies travel to all the different organs. So your bloodstream is like a highway. And when you produce antibodies, those antibodies get into your highway and it travels to your different organs. And exercise increases and it improves the efficiency of your bloodstream highway. And so exercise, and it doesn't have to be anything elaborate. Walking 30 minutes, 5 days a week with a mask on makes a huge difference. So those three simple things actually are very efficacious.
Let's see. Another question here says, are people who have been vaccinated, are they essentially being followed to see if they get the virus, and if so, monitor how severe their cases are, specifically if those vaccinated need to be vaccinated?
Okay. So for those who are in the clinical trials, which now are probably over 80,000, yeah, those individuals are being monitored on a regular basis, and to see if there's any new side effects, also to see if they will come down with a milder form of the virus or the virus at all. For once we roll this, once this is rolled out into the general population, um, they're asking folks who get the vaccine that if they have any side effects, to self-report these to their doctors, or there's probably going to be a website, because by collecting this safety information as we roll it out to the broader population will be real important. But that's a work still in progress. Um, um, and so we won't know the answer to some of those questions until we get out to more individuals.
And then we just one more that I've seen a consistency in the chat, especially as it pertains to autoimmune diseases, disorders, and the vaccine. So if possible, Dr. Sanders, if you could maybe touch on that one more time, and then we'll probably close it down.
Okay. So autoimmune disorders like rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, those are the big two, and the others are relatively rare. And as I said, I'm a rheumatologist, so I'm used to treating a lot of patients with these disorders. When I was treating folks with these illnesses, if their disease was under control, then I recommended that they get the flu vaccine and the influenza and the pneumococcal vaccine. That will probably be the same thing with this vaccine. And so if you have lupus and your lupus is under control, you have rheumatoid arthritis and your rheumatoid arthritis is under control, I suspect your rheumatologist or whoever's treating you for your immune disorder will recommend you get the vaccine, because people who are even more susceptible to the virus will be those who have immune-based diseases, because your immune system is already altered, already weakened. And so you need all the help you can get. But there's not data in giving the vaccine to people who have active disease. And that's the part that we still need to be evaluated. But probably if your immune disorder is under control, then you would probably be okay to get the vaccine. But once again, you should have that discussion with your rheumatologist or your doctor. But once again, I think that once we get farther along in this thing, then they're going to recommend it for everybody. I can remember a day when we used to didn't give vaccines to lupus patients, but that was not just because we didn't know, and a lot of it had to do with vaccines were given to lupus patients who had active disease versus those who were in remission or controlled. So that would be my recommendation.
All right. Well, we thank you. I don't really see. There's been some help in the chat as well from your fellow medical professional comrades as it pertains to.
Good. So, Brother Ford, can I just address one thing and then I'll let it go?
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
And I just want to talk about the Tuskegee 626 trial, okay? Because I get asked that question a lot. I'm surprised I didn't come up in this. So let me just say this. So Tuskegee 626 was a study of us back in Alabama who got syphilis. And penicillin was around. So penicillin could have been given to these individuals and cured their syphilis. But that study was, they wanted to see the natural progression of syphilis. So they withheld penicillin so they could study the natural progression of syphilis. So then you fast forward to COVID, and I showed you a ton of information about the natural progression of COVID. those of us, some folks will get lucky and won't have any problems. Others may die. Others may get long-term side effects, other from the disease, and some may get long-term lung damage. And in this case, people are wanting to give folks the vaccine so they don't get the disease. And so, or if they get it, they get a mild case, or so they don't transmit it to anybody else. Totally two different situations. And so there's really, it's apples and oranges. There's no comparison. Tuskegee, they withheld treatment. COVID is not a clinical trial, for one thing. And number two is we have effective vaccines. And so if the vaccine's withheld, then you could say, oh, that's Tuskegee all over again. But in this case, people are wanting you to get the vaccine. And so I'm going to go back just a little bit. HIV. So I was a young man and studying HIV because I have a degree as well in immunology at the University of Cincinnati in the latter 80s. HIV in the latter 80s, we didn't know a lot about it. And I worked in the lab because we didn't even know how it spread. We thought it was just a white male homosexual disease. And then it started spreading in the Black community, particularly among Black men. And I can remember, and Brother Ford has heard me say this, when Magic Johnson got HIV, I thought he was a dead man walking, because that's usually got HIV, you die. But they set up clinical trials in the African American community. Magic Johnson was one of the first folks to get on a clinical trial, and you know the results. He's still alive today. If you take your HIV medications, you can control the disease. There was a study done in 2007 at the NIH, and they were looking at African American males with HIV, and at the time, and in particularly trials. And so it was interesting that a lot of African American males were not enrolled in HIV trials, but it was not because they didn't want to. It was because they weren't asked to. So in this particular study, it was in Pittsburgh. They asked a bunch of Black males who had HIV, if you had the chance to be in a clinical trial for HIV, knowing that you could die from it, would you sign up for a clinical trial? 86% of African American males in 2007 said, yes, I would sign up for it, because they realized that if you got HIV, you didn't get a treatment, it was death. If you look at COVID, some people will be in that 98.3%, but some of us might be in that 1.7%, and then you've got the long-term damage and stuff like that. So I just want people to put that in perspective, because you'll hear this comparison between the two, and the comparison is really not a valid comparison. It's totally different. So I'll close on that note. And but I want to thank the elders and Brother Ford for giving me this opportunity. I'm a member of the Lord's Church. If you guys have questions you want to ask me separately, just give me a call and we can talk about it. So thank you again, Brother Ford, and I'll turn it back over to you.
Yes, indeed. We want to thank everyone who was in attendance, and we want to thank Brother Sanders, Dr. Brother Sanders, for giving us his wealth of knowledge. If we were all together, Dr. Sanders, we would stand up and clap for you, my brother. So we really, really thank you for everything that you do. And we want to thank everybody for sticking around. And you haven't missed anything, because the Browns don't play till later. I wanted to make sure that we know that. And just speaking from a statistical perspective, right? If I say 1.7%, you may look at that as a small number, but if I say 3 or 4 million, it changes the narrative. And so this session will be available later. Daisy, we actually put the link up there on the in the chat, and it's on our YouTube page as well. So if you want to go back and revisit this information again, you have the ability to do so. If